We had been to York, the town east of Perth in the Avon Valley, the oldest inland town in Western Australia. We'd done some research into my great-grandfather who had been in this area as a ticket of leave convict. We'd found some useful information at the new Archive Centre at York, and we then continued travelling east to the goldfields. It was while in Kalgoorlie we discovered another family member connection to an amazing story that had made the newspapers nationwide. It was also an amazing coincidence that the event took place near the rabbit-proof fence, a place we had passed through earlier in the day. We were further amazed to find that the story was the basis of a film made for television.
Love a good murder mystery? Here's one that's true. The character's Arthur Upfield. He became a famous international crime writer.
The whole town is talking about your book.
But in 1928, he was fixing fences and collecting ideas for his stories. He wanted to create the perfect murder. No body, no evidence. George, a lovable drunk, had the solution.
The killer gathers all the burnt pieces of bone and grinds them to a powder in a dolly pot.
Snowy Rolls was a charming drifter.
Wouldn't have loved him.
With a very dark side. On hearing the discussions, he was inspired to murder. Detective Harry Manning suspected Snowy was a killer, and he'd read Arthur Upfield's recently published book.
I found it very helpful in tracking the suspect.
The amazing true story of a writer who inspired a serial killer.
Arthur William Upfield was born in 1890 and died in 1964. He was an English-Australian writer, best known for his works of detective fiction. He wrote over 30 books. Snowy Rolls used the murder method that had been suggested by Upfield in his then unpublished book, The Sands of Windee, in which he described a foolproof way to dispose of a body and thus commit the perfect murder. Upfield later wrote another book giving his account of his involvement in the murder trial and his understanding of the events. The Murchison murders took place at Haunted Hut at the 183 Mile Bore on the rabbit-proof fence. The victims were Lewis Carron, George Lloyd and James Ryan. They had been working in that area but disappeared at the end of 1929. Their disappearance remained a mystery for 2 years until Snowy Rolls was arrested for another matter and was found to be in possession of Ryan and Lloyd's ute, along with personal items belonging to Lewis Carron. No one knows how the victims died, but strychnine poisoning combined with shooting has been suspected. Their bodies were burnt using firewood mixed with some dead animals. The bones were then pulverised, and the site was made to appear that dead animals had been disposed of so as not to contaminate the water supply at the campsite. Detective Sergeant Harry Manning later found more incriminating evidence in the ashes at the bore near Haunted Hut, such as a bullet, Carron's gold wedding ring, charred finger bones and artificial teeth. Snowy Rolls was charged with the murder of Lewis Carron. There seemed little doubt that Rolls had committed 3 murders, and on 19th of March 1932, the jury returned a guilty verdict after only 2 hours of deliberations. Rolls was sentenced to death. Rolls' attempts to appeal against his conviction were rejected, and he was hanged at Fremantle Prison on 13th of June 1932. George Henry Lloyd was my great-uncle. He was born in Mundalla in 1899. He was the 4th child of William and Sarah Lloyd, who had lived at Lenswood at Brayside, while William worked as an engineer at the Lenswood Case and Timber Mills. George married Jessie Lang in 1923, and they had 2 children, Jean and Frank. George had 8 siblings, one being Violet, who married Ben Lawrence, and they had a child, Ivy, who was my mother. In the Depression in 1929, George travelled with his brother-in-law Walter Wisson to Western Australia. Walter had bought land at Burracopen near the rabbit-proof fence. George found work with a partner, James Ryan, well digging and fencing. They were last seen in December 1929. George's family back in Adelaide were desperate to learn what had become of him. Jessie lived in Carrington Street, Adelaide, and ran a cafe in Pulteney Street. She had to give up the business as she was threatened with a nervous breakdown. She had sent a letter to Rolls pleading for him to tell her the truth. She said that unless she knew for certain about her husband's death, she would never tell the children. "It is better that they should remain in ignorance of the whole affair," she said. In 1934, some false teeth from the ashes were sent to Adelaide, and they were identified as belonging to George. He was then pronounced to be dead. Jessie then married Frank Dumain that same year. A telemovie based on the Murchison murders was screened on the ABC in 2009. It was entitled 3 Acts of Murder. The role of George Lloyd was played by Ian Meadows. Arthur Upfield's books featuring Detective Inspector Napoleon Boney Bonaparte of the Queensland Police Force were the basis for a 1970s Australian television series entitled Boney, as well as a 1990 telemovie and a 1992 spin-off TV series.